like to call this hearing to order. I apologize to our witnesses that we had a vote that was called at 10 o'clock, and most members are in the process of making their way from there to here. This morning, the committee will engage in an activity that's quite rare for us, an open hearing on an ongoing critical intelligence question, the role of Russian active measures past and present. As many of you know, this committee is conducting a thorough, independent, and nonpartisan review of the Russian active measures campaign conducted against the 2016 U.S. elections. Some of the intelligence provided to the committee is extremely sensitive and requires that most of the work be conducted in a secure setting to maintain the integrity of the information and to protect the very sensitive sources and methods that gave us access to that intelligence. However, the Vice Chairman and I understand the gravity of the issues that we're here reviewing and have decided that it's crucial that we take the rare step of discussing publicly an ongoing intelligence question. That's why we've convened this second open hearing on the topic of Russian active measures. And I can assure you, to the extent possible, the committee will hold additional open hearings on this issue. The American public, indeed all democratic societies, need to understand that malign actors are using old techniques with new platforms to undermine our democratic institutions. This hearing, entitled Disinformation, a Primer in Russian Active Measures and Influence Campaigns, will consist of two panels and will provide a foundational understanding of Russian active measures and information operations campaigns. The first panel will examine the history and characteristics of those campaigns. The second panel will examine the history and characteristics of those campaigns and the role and capabilities of cyber operations in support of these activities. Unfortunately, you will learn today that these efforts by Russia to discredit the U.S. and weaken the West are not new. These efforts are, in fact, at the heart of Russian and previous Soviet Union intelligence efforts. You will learn today that our community has been a target of Russian information warfare, propaganda, and cyber campaigns, and still is. The efforts our experts will outline today continue unabated. The takeaway from today's hearing: we're all targets of a sophisticated and capable adversary, and we must engage in a whole-of-government approach to combat Russian active measures. Today, we'll receive testimony from experts who have, in some cases, worked directly to respond to active measures, who understand the history and the context of active measures, and whose significant experience and knowledge will shed new light on the problem and provide useful context. Drs. Goodson and Rumer, Mr. Watts, we're grateful to you for your appearance here today. This afternoon, we will reconvene and welcome witnesses who will discuss the technical side of the question, cyber operations, including computer network exploitation, social media, and online propaganda activities, and how they enable and promote Russian influence campaigns and information operations. We have a full day ahead of us, and I'm confident that the testimony you will hear today will help you to establish a foundational understanding of the problem as the community continues its inquiry into Russian activities. Finally, I'd like to commend the Vice Chairman for his dedication to the goals of the committee's inquiry and to the integrity of the process. The Vice Chairman and I realize that if we politicize this process, our efforts will likely fail. The public deserves to hear the truth about possible Russian involvement in our elections, how they came to be involved, how we may have failed to prevent that involvement, what actions were taken in response, if any, and what we plan to do to ensure the integrity of future free elections at the heart of our democracy. Gentlemen, thank you again for your willingness to be here, and I turn to the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome our witnesses today. Today's hearing is important to help understand the role Russia played in the 2016 presidential elections. As the U.S. intelligence community, unanimously assessed in January of this year, Russia sought to hijack our democratic process, and that most important part of our democratic process, our presidential elections. As we'll learn today, Russia's strategy and tactics are not new, but their brazenness certainly was. The hearing is also important because it's open, as the chairman mentioned, which is sometimes unusual for this committee. Due to the classified nature of our work, we typically work behind closed doors. But today's public hearing will help, I hope, the American public writ large understand how the Kremlin made effective use of its hacking skills to steal and weaponize information and engage in a coordinated effort to damage a particular candidate and to undermine public confidence in our democratic process. Our witnesses today will help us to understand how Russia deployed this deluge of disinformation in a broader attempt to undermine America's strength and leadership throughout the world. We simply must, and we will, get this right. The chairman and I agree it is vitally important that we do this as a credible, bipartisan, and transparent manner as possible. As was said yesterday at our press conference, Chairman Burr and I trust each other, and equally important, we trust our colleagues on this committee that we are going to move together and we're going to get to the bottom of this and do it right. As this hearing begins, let's take just one moment to review what we already know. Russia's President Vladimir Putin ordered a deliberate campaign carefully constructed to undermine our election. First, Russia struck at our political institutions by electronically breaking into the headquarters of one of our political parties and stealing vast amounts of information. Russian operatives also hacked emails to steal personal messages and other information from individuals ranging from Clinton campaign manager John Podesta to former Secretary of State Colin Powell. This stolen information was then weaponized. We know that Russian intelligence used the quote-unquote Guccifer II persona and others like WikiLeaks and seemingly choreographed times that would cause maximum damage to one candidate. They did this with an unprecedented level of sophistication about American presidential politics that should be a line of inquiry for us on this committee. And candidly, while it helped one candidate this time, they are not favoring one party over another, and consequently it should be a concern for all of us. Second, Russia continually sought to diminish and undermine our trust in the American media by blurring our faith in what is true and what is not. Russian propaganda outlets like RT and Sputnik successfully produced and peddled disinformation to American audiences in pursuit of Moscow's preferred outcome. This Russian propaganda on steroids was designed to poison the national conversation in America. The Russians employed thousands of paid internet trolls and botnets to push out disinformation and fake news at a high volume, focusing this material onto your Twitter and Facebook feeds and flooding our social media with misinformation. This fake news and disinformation was then hyped by the American media echo chamber and our own social media networks to reach and potentially influence millions of America. This is not innuendo or false allegations. This is not fake news. This is actually what happened to us. Russia continues these sorts of actions as we speak. Some of our close allies in Europe are experiencing exactly the same kind of interference in their political process. Germany has said that its parliament has been hacked. French presidential candidates right now have been the subject of Russian propaganda and disinformation. In the Netherlands, their recent elections, the Dutch hand-counted their ballots because they feared Russian interference in their electoral process. Perhaps most critically for us, there is nothing to stop them from doing this all over again in 2018, for those of you who are up, or in 2020, as Americans, again, go back to the polls. In addition to what we already know, any full accounting must also find out what, if any, contacts, communications, or connections occurred between Russia and those associated with the campaigns themselves. I will not prejudge the outcome of our investigation. We are seeking to determine if there is an actual fire, but there is clearly a lot of smoke. For instance, an individual associated with the Trump campaign accurately predicted the release of hacked emails weeks before it happened. This same individual also admits to being in contact with Guccifer II, the Russian intelligence persona responsible for these cyber operations. The platform of one of our two major political parties was mysteriously watered down in a way which promoted the interest of President Putin. And no one seems to be able to identify who directed that change in the platform. A campaign manager of one campaign who played such a critical role in electing the president was forced to step down over his alleged ties to Russia and its associates. Since the election, we've seen the president's national security advisor resign and his attorney general recuse himself over previously undisclosed contacts with the Russian government. And of course, in the other body, on March 20th, the director of the FBI publicly acknowledged that the Bureau is, quote, investigating the nature of any links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and whether there was any coordination between the campaign and Russian efforts, end of quote. I want to make clear, at least for me, this information is not about whether you have a D or an R next to your name. It is not about relitigating last fall's election. It is about clearly understanding and responding to this very real threat. It's also, I believe, about holding Russia accountable for this unprecedented attack on our democracy. And it is about arming ourselves so we can identify and stop it when it happens again. And trust me, it will happen again if we don't take action. I would hope that the President is as anxious as we are to get to the bottom of what happened. But I have to say editorially that the President's recent contact with his wild and uncorroborated accusations about wiretapping and his inappropriate and unjustified attacks on America's hardworking intelligence professionals does give me grave concern. This committee has a heavy weight of responsibility that prove that we can continue to put our political labels aside to get us to the truth. I believe we can get there. I've seen firsthand, and I say this to our audience, how serious members on both sides of this dais have worked on this sensitive and critical issue. As the chairman and I have said repeatedly, this investigation will follow the facts where they lead us. If at any time I believe we're not going to be able to get those facts, and we're working together very cooperatively to make sure we get the facts that we need from the intelligence community, we will get that done. Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for your commitment to the serious work and your commitment to keeping this bipartisan cooperation, at least, if not all across the Hill, alive in this committee. Thank you very much.
I thank the Vice Chairman. Members should note that they will be recognized by seniority for 5-minute questions. We'll go as expeditiously as we can. Let me introduce our witnesses today, if I may, and then we will hear from those witnesses. Dr. Rory Godson, Emeritus Professor of Government, Georgetown University. Dr. Godson has specialized in security studies and international relations at Georgetown University for more than 4 decades. Thank you for that. As a scholar, he helped pioneer intelligence studies in American higher education, editing the 7-volume series Intelligence Requirements for the 1980s, 1990s, and co-founding the Consortium for Study of Intelligence. He's directed, managed, and published with other scholars and practitioners innovative studies on adapting American security paradigm, intelligence dominance consistent with the rule of law practices, and strategies for preventing and countering global organized crime. Dr. Godson has served as a consultant to the United States Security Council, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and related agencies of the U.S. government. Thank you for your service, and thank you for being here. Dr. Rumer is a senior fellow and director of Russian and Eurasian programs at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to joining Carnegie, Dr. Rumer served as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2010 to 2014. Earlier, he held research appointments at the National Defense University, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the RAND Corporation. He has served on the National Security Council staff and at the State Department, taught at Georgetown University and George Washington University, and published widely. Welcome, Dr. Rumer. Clint Watts. Clint Watts is a Robert Fox Fellow for the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a senior fellow at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at George Washington University. Clint's a consultant and researcher, modeling and forecasting threat actor behavior and developing countermeasures for disrupting, defeating state and non-state actors. As a consultant, Clint designs and implements customized training and research programs for the military, intelligence, law enforcement organizations at the federal, state, and local levels. Clint served as a United States Army infantry officer, an FBI agent on a joint terrorism task force, as the executive officer of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and as a consultant to the FBI's Counterterrorism Division and National Security Branch. Clint, welcome. Thank you for your service. With that, I will recognize our witnesses from my left to right, and Dr. Godson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman and members of the committee for inviting me to this hearing. I'd like to begin with just with a minute or two on the long history of Soviet active measures, and then talk a little bit about some of the major advantages the Soviets have and the Russians have reaped from their history of using this instrument. Finally, I'd like to come to what we have done in the past to reduce the effectiveness of Soviet behavior and what we might want to consider for the future. I think if one looks at the history of the last 100 years, you're going to find that the Russians and the Soviet predecessors have believed that active measures is a major tool for their advancement. They actually believe, whatever we think about it, that this gives them the possibility of achieving influence well beyond their economic and social status and conditions in their country. I think when you look at what they say now, what they do now, and the way they act and practice and talk about their active measures, they take this subject very seriously. Sometimes we in the United States have been aware of this, but for many, many decades, we did not take this subject seriously, and they were able to take enormous advantages. I think today that they basically believe they can use these techniques rather similarly to many of the ways they did this in the past. I do think that they are repeating many of the same practices that they did in the past. Yes, there may be some new techniques that are being used now. In fact, there are. And some of my colleagues on the panel and this afternoon are more expert on those techniques, particularly the use of the internet and particularly cyberspace. But we can sort of more or less be rest assured that the Soviets will be looking at other techniques and will be seeking to adapt and make their active measures much more productive for them in the future. Yes, the activities in the United States that you're particularly interested in do seem to be exceptional. We don't have very many other examples of where they interfered with election machinery, electoral apparatuses. What we do have are many, many examples of where the Soviets, working together, were able, with their allies abroad, their agents of influence abroad, to actually affect the elections in many, many countries in the 20th and early 21st century. The Soviets and their Russian successors took the view and take the view that they are able to hit above their weight. They can fight above their weight if they take to use active measures. They don't want to go to war. Neither of us wants to go to war, but they take the view that they can actually achieve a lot of what they want to do through their active measures. That is the combination of overt and covert techniques and resources. Overt and covert combined together in one pattern, and that they have the authority and the responsibility as leaders of the country to be able to do that. And they put this into practice. In the 20s and 30s, they created an enormous apparatus in the world. Russia was a poor, weak country, and yet Russia in the 20s and 30s set up whole organizations, overt and covert, throughout the world. They were able to challenge all the major powers of Europe and the United States. We may not have realized that these organizations were being set up, but they were considerable, and it took a lot of effort and skill on their part to do this. In the war of Second World War, they used this apparatus to be able to influence the politics of Europe after the war. Yes, they also used it during the war to help them, and sometimes us, in fighting the Nazis and the Italian fascists. But in their sort of in a major way, they were also preparing for being able to influence the outcome of the struggle for the balance of power in Europe during World War II. So while they were an ally, they were also planning to undermine democratic and liberal parties, including in the United States at that time. In fact, they were able to take advantage of the fact that we were friendly and that we were working together, that Uncle Joe was a friend of the United States at that time, they thought. And they were able to use that very successfully. And so as a result, they were nearly able to take over the balance of power in Western Europe. It was a closely run contest. And of course, we're all glad that they lost. But it was a very closely run conflict, and we did emerge successfully from it. In the 1980s, they were on another roll. They used their apparatus, which built up in the 20s and 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, to be able to achieve a great deal in the late 70s and 80s. They nearly were able to split Europe, split NATO in Europe in the 1980s. They started that in the last years of the Carter administration and continued into the Reagan years. And fortunately, we noticed this in time, and our rearmament of NATO went ahead, and it wasn't because the Soviets wanted it, but because we were able to outmaneuver them. The 90s were sort of chaotic there, and so it was their active measures apparatus wasn't very effective, and it didn't have the kind of leadership that it had had before, and the kind of leadership it has gained since Vladimir Putin came to power. It's maybe a little bit too soon to do an assessment of their effectiveness. So far, as was pointed out earlier by the chairman, the vice chairman, we do think that they were effective in an important way to us. And we understand that the committee is going to be looking into this and studying this. But in any event, they have this apparatus. They have modernized it. They were spending billions of dollars a year before. They have maybe 10 to 15,000 people in this apparatus, at least worldwide, in addition to the trolls and other kinds of cyber capabilities they have. But the Soviets are not 10
Dr.
feet
Godson,
tall.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second, just to make members aware that the second vote has started, and it's our intent to work through this second vote. So I'd ask members, as they feel comfortable, to leave for the vote. Come right back, if you will. As soon as we get through the panel, we'll start questions. And Dr. Godson, I just ask you to summarize as quickly as you can,
Mr. Chairman,
because
how
we
long
want
is around so that we can? decide
5-minute
when we go?
recognitions.
I can go? You can
Yeah,
go?
yeah.
Okay.
They're going to keep the vote.
Well, they're not 10 feet tall. They have used their capabilities effectively, but they don't always win out. The United States, for the first time, responded in a major way to them in the late 1940s through the 1960s. We did, in fact, cauterize their active measures apparatus, and they were not able to successfully use this in Western Europe and other parts of the world. We did some things pretty well from the 40s to the 60s. Unfortunately, in the 60s, there was the coalition between liberals and conservatives. The consensus between the Congress and the administration started to fall apart. And then with the criticisms that the intelligence community had to take in that time, our countermeasures started to fall apart, and we were sort of disarming ourselves, if I can say that. And so from the 60s through the late 1970s, we did not have a very effective counter-active measures capability, and the Russians, of course, took advantage of that in numerous places of the world. In the 80s, though, that changed. Late 70s, 80s, it changed, and we did start to do things well again. I'll just summarize the fact that we started to develop a strategic approach to countermeasures. It wasn't a bit here and a bit there and so on. It was actually a strategic approach with warning and anticipation of active measures. We would actually study them so well that we were able to often anticipate what they were going to do with active measures, and so therefore we could then use other measures to limit them and avoid the effectiveness of these active measures. We also started to support liberal elements abroad that we thought would be helpful to us in preventing Soviet active measures from furthering Soviet objectives in those societies. So we were fairly successful in the 80s in doing this, and in both using overt and covert methods to do this. As in other sort of victories that we've had after World War I or after World War II, after the Cold War, we thought that this wasn't such an important thing to be doing anymore. And so our activities waned. They didn't stop, but they waned. We had some units that remained in the government that were concerned with this, but on the whole, the government actually disarmed itself. And so, although there were some in the government and outside the government who warned about the Soviet use of active measures, and I do know when looking over the website of your committee that some of the people in this room actually went to the government and asked the government to be more mindful of Soviet active measures starting in 2016, and presumably that we should be mindful of it afterwards. Unfortunately, the government did not take the warnings as seriously as it could have, and made this known to the public in a useful fashion, so we would not be so surprised when this took place in or it appears to have taken place in 2016. But the Soviets could not have done this, and the Russians cannot have done this without having an active measures apparatus. It's visible. One can find it. Can't find everything about it, but we have, historically, we know that we can find it, we can anticipate it, and we can take a number of measures. And so I hope you will have time to consider, maybe in the questioning, some of the measures we could now take to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Godson. Dr. Rumer.
Chairman Burr, Vice Chairman Warner, distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to be here today. Russian active measures and interference in our presidential campaign is one of the most contentious issues in our national conversation. I believe that Russian intelligence services and their proxies intervened in our election in 2016. I have not seen the classified evidence behind the intelligence community assessment published a few weeks ago. Some have criticized it for not sharing the evidence of Russian intrusions. They missed the mark. It is the totality of Russian efforts in plain sight to mislead, to misinform, to exaggerate that is more convincing than any cyber evidence. RT, Russia Today broadcasts, internet trolls, fake news, and so on are an integral part of Russian foreign policy today. We need to put this in the context of the quarter century since the end of the Cold War. World War II in Europe, or the Great Patriotic War, as Russians call it, is integral to the formative experience of every living Russian. The country's national narrative is impossible without it. In 1941, Hitler's armies were stopped just outside the gates of Moscow. In 1945, Stalin's armies entered Berlin. That was Russia's greatest generation. Generations of Russians since then have been taught that their country was at its most secure then because it was protected by a buffer, the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Empire. In 1991, Russians lost that buffer, the legacy of their greatest generation. With their country falling apart, Russian leaders had no choice but to accept this loss for as long as Russia would remain weak. The 90s were a terrible decade for Russia, but a great decade for the West. For Russian leaders and many regular Russians, the dominance of the West came at the expense of Russia's loss in the Cold War. But Russia would not remain weak indefinitely. Its economic recovery led to a return to a much more assertive posture, aggressive posture, some would say, on the world stage. We saw it in the crushing of Georgia in 2008, in the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and we see it to the present day in the ongoing war in eastern Ukraine. For the West, Russia's return to the world stage has been nothing more than pure revanchism. For Russia, it is restoring some balance in their relationship with the West. The narrative of restoring the balance, correcting the injustice and the distortions of the 1990s has been absolutely essential to Russian propaganda since the beginning of the Putin era. Those Russians who disagree are branded as foreign agents and enemies of the people. But Russia's capabilities should not be overestimated. Its GDP is about $1.3 trillion versus US GDP of over $18 trillion. Russian defense spending is estimated at about $65 billion. That's a little more than President Trump's proposed increase in US defense spending for FY 2018. The Russian military is undeniably stronger than its smaller and weaker neighbors. Yet the balance does not favor Russia when compared to NATO. A NATO-Russia war would be an act of mutual suicide, and the Kremlin is not ready for it. Russian leaders have embraced a different toolkit: information warfare, intimidation, espionage, economic tools, and so on. This toolkit is meant to make up for Russia's conventional shortcomings vis-à-vis the West. The Kremlin has a number of advantages here. The circle of deciders is limited to a handful of Putin associates with similar worldviews. They have considerable resources at their disposal, especially since most of their tools are quite cheap. A handful of cyber criminals cost a lot less than an armored brigade, but can do a lot of damage. Russian meddling in our presidential election most likely is viewed by the Kremlin as an unqualified success. The payoffs include, but are not limited to: 1, a major distraction to the United States, for the United States; damage to U.S. leadership in the world; and perhaps most importantly, the demonstration effect. The Kremlin can do this to the world's sole remaining global superpower. Imagine how other countries see it. The differences between Russia and the United States are profound and will not be resolved soon. This is not a crisis, not something that will pass soon. It is the new normal. We will see Russia relying on this toolkit in the months and years to come, in the upcoming elections in France and in Germany this year, in our own future political campaigns. Deception and active measures have long been and will remain a staple of Russia's dealings with the outside world for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Dr. Rumor, thank you. Mr. Watts?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. In April 2014, Andrew Weisberg, J.M. Berger, and I noticed a petition on the whitehouse.gov website. Alaska Back to Russia appeared as a public campaign to give America's largest state back to the nation from which it was purchased. Satirical or nonsensical petitions appearing on the White House website are not out of the norm. But this petition was different, having gained more than 39,000 online signatures in a short period. Our examination of those signing and posting on this petition revealed an odd pattern. The accounts varied considerably from other petitions and appeared to be the work of bots. A closer look at those bots tied in closely with other social media campaigns we had observed pushing Russian propaganda months before. Hackers proliferated the networks and could be spotted amongst recent data breaches and website defacements. Closely circling those hackers were honeypot accounts, attractive-looking women, political partisans that were trying to social engineer other users. Above all, we observed hecklers, those synchronized trolling accounts you see on Twitter that would attack political targets using similar talking patterns and points. Those accounts, some of which overtly support the Kremlin, promoted Russian foreign policy positions targeting key English-speaking audiences throughout Europe and North America. Soviet active measures, strategy, and tactics have been reborn and updated for the modern Russian regime in the digital age. Today, Russia hopes to win the Second Cold War through the force of politics as opposed to the politics of force. While Russia certainly seeks to promote Western candidates sympathetic to their worldview and foreign policy objectives, winning a single election is not their end goal. Russian active measures hope to topple democracies through the pursuit of five complementary objectives. 1, undermine citizen confidence in democratic governance. 2, foment and exasperate divisive political fissures. 3, erode trust between citizens and elected officials and their institutions. 4, popularize Russian policy agendas within foreign populations. And 5, create general distrust or confusion over information sources by blurring the lines between fact and fiction, a very pertinent issue today in our country. From these objectives, the Kremlin can crumble democracies from the inside out, achieving 2 key milestones. 1, the dissolution of the European Union, and 2, the breakup of NATO. Achieving these 2 victories against the West will allow Russia to reassert its power globally and pursue its foreign policy objectives bilaterally through military, diplomatic, and economic aggression. In late 2014 and throughout 2015, we watched active measures on nearly any disaffected U.S. audience, whether it be claims of the U.S. military declaring martial law during the Jade Helm exercise, chaos amongst Black Lives Matter protests, or a standoff at the Bundy Ranch. Russia's state-sponsored outlets of RT and Sputnik News, characterized as white outlets, churned out manipulated truths, false news stories, and conspiracies. They generally lined up under 4 themes. 1, political messages designed to tarnish democratic leaders and institutions. 2, financial propaganda created to weaken confidence in financial markets and capitalist economies. 3, social unrest crafted to amplify divisions amongst democratic populaces. And 4, global calamity pushed to incite fear of global demise, such as nuclear war or catastrophic climate change. From these overt Russian propaganda outlets, a wide range of English-speaking conspiratorial websites, which we refer to as gray outlets, some of which mysteriously operate from Eastern Europe and are curiously led by pro-Russian editors of unknown financing, sensationalize these conspiracies and fake news published by white outlets. American-looking social media accounts, the hecklers, honeypots, and hackers I described earlier, working aside automated bots, further amplify this Russian propaganda amongst unwitting Westerners. Through the end of 2015 and start of 2016, the Russian influence system began pushing themes and messages seeking to influence the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. Russia's overt media outlets and covert trolls sought to sideline opponents on both sides of the political spectrum with adversarial views towards the Kremlin. They were in full swing during both the Republican and Democratic primary season and may have helped sink the hopes of candidates more hostile to Russian interests long before the field narrowed. Senator Rubio, in my opinion, you anecdotally suffered from these efforts. The final piece of Russia's modern active measures surfaced in the summer of 2016 as hacked materials were strategically leaked. The disclosures of WikiLeaks, Guccifer 2.0, and DC Leaks demonstrated how hacks would power the influence system Russia had built so successfully in the previous 2 years. As an example, on the evening of 30 July 2016, my colleagues and I watched as RT and Sputnik News simultaneously launched false stories of the U.S. airbase in Incirlik, Turkey being overrun by terrorists. Within minutes, pro-Russian social media aggregators and automated bots amplified this false news story. More than 4,000 tweets in the first 78 minutes after launching this false story, linked back to the active measures accounts we'd tracked in the previous 2 years. These previously identified accounts, almost simultaneously appearing from different geographic locations and communities, amplified the fake news story in unison. The hashtags pushed by these accounts were nuclear, media, Trump, Benghazi. The most common words found in English-speaking Twitter user profiles were God, military, Trump, family, country, conservative, Christian, America, and Constitution. These accounts and their messages clearly sought to convince Americans a U.S. military base was being overrun in a terrorist attack. In reality, a small protest gathered outside the gate, and the increased security at the air base sought to secure the arrival of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Many of the accounts we watched push the false Incirlik story today focus on the elections in Europe, promoting fears of immigration or false claims of refugee criminality. They've not forgotten about the U.S. either. This past week, we observed social media accounts discrediting Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, hoping to further foment unrest inside U.S. democratic institutions. The implications of Russia's new active measures model will be twofold. The first is what the world is witnessing today, a Russian challenge to democracies throughout the West. But more importantly, over the horizon, Russia has provided any authoritarian dictator or predatory elite equipped with hackers and disrespectful of civil liberties a playbook to dismantle their enemies through information warfare. The U.S., in failing to respond to active measures, will surrender its position in the world's, as the world's leader, forego its role as chief promoter and defender of democracy, and give up on over 70 years of collective action to preserve freedom and civil liberties around the world. Russia's strategic motto for America and the West is divided they stand and divided they will fall. It's time the United States reminds the world that despite our day-to-day policy debates and political squabbles, we stand united alongside our allies in defending our democratic system of government from the meddling of power-hungry tyrants and repressive authoritarians that prey on their people and suppress humanity. I'll close here with my opening remarks, but I have many recommendations which are in my written testimony. Mr. Chairman, I ask that my full written statement, which includes these recommendations, be submitted to the record, and I hope that during the question and answer session, we can further discuss how we might counter these active measures. Thank you for inviting me.
Mr. Watts, thank you for your testimony, and all written testimony will be included as part of the record. The chair and the vice chairman are going to exit and vote. I'm going to recognize Senator Risch for his questions, and in our absence, he'll lob back and forth based upon seniority. Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, it always impresses me, the fact that when we hear people talking about Russian policy and what they want, first of all, how uniform it is. Everybody seems to agree on where they're going, what they do, and what they're doing to get there. But after processing that over a long period of time, one's got to come to the thought process of what happens in a post-Putin Russia, because everyone's got a shelf life, and his has been extended. It looks to me well beyond what normally would happen under these circumstances. So, give me your thoughts briefly, each of you, if you would, as to what happens. Do they stay on the same track they're on, or do they come to the realization that there's bigger and better things in life to pursue than what they're doing right now? Mr. Godson?
Well, thank you for the question. There's a lot, as you know, a lot of variables here at work. One would be how we respond to Putin and the behavior of the apparatus that they have. Do we let them continue to do this, or do we start to develop some sort of a strategic response to them? That would be one of the variables. Do they find that they can get away with, use active measures as they have in the past? And if so, then the elite that has taken power in Russia would be inclined to continue They found that even when they sometimes have not been as effective as they expected, that active measure still is a capability that enables them to use the example of being able to fight above their economic and political capabilities. So unless there was a dramatic change in the regime, there's little reason to believe that they would cease the active measures policy and strategy they have, barring that we don't actually cauterize it and limit its effectiveness. If we don't, then they'll have an incentive to continue.
Dr. Hoover?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Putin, I believe, is 62, a man in his prime. He's positioned to run in 2018 again for another 6-year term. So I think what we see today is going to be with us for a long time. By the looks of it, for the next 2 presidential terms in this country. And so we should base our policy accordingly. I think it would be incorrect and counterproductive to tar all Russians with the same brush. But there's something there in Russian traditional security perceptions that transcend party lines, that transcend regimes, and Russian perceptions of security don't really change all that much over time. So I think we should be thinking about the drivers of Russian foreign and security policy in terms of continuity rather than radical change. After all, we already saw radical change in 1991, and things in the end didn't really change that much. As long as Russian elites will see themselves, as long as they see themselves as being inferior and struggling against a more advanced and a more powerful Western alliance, they will be relying on all tools in their toolkit, and information warfare will be part, disinformation will be part of it. We may hope that if someday someone like the corruption fighter Alexei Navalny gets elected, rises to the leadership of the country, having been a victim of such disinformation, he may be more restrained in it. But I would say that the basic parameters of Russian policy are generally set in place.
Thank you, Doctor. I've only got a short time left. I want to hear from Mr. Watts.
Yes. Regarding Mr.
Well,
Putin,
ready.
I would look to these 2 gentlemen primarily, but my thoughts are, 1, he's not going away anytime soon. 2, he will definitely shape some sort of a successor in his place to continue on with what he's doing right now. I think the third big thing that we can't discount is the connection with criminality. There is, between these elites and their sort of predatory capitalist practices, what we see in cyberspace with cybercrime and how they've used hackers very, very well as part of their active measures, we can't discount that we'll see a predatory elite emerge that will be something we have to deal with. And I think the fourth thing, which goes to the first point, is I'm not sure what our policy or stance is with regards to Russia at this point in the United States. And I think that's the #1 thing we have to figure out, because that will shape how they interface with us. Having watched the end of the Soviet Union as a cadet at West Point and then fast forwarding to today, I'm a little bit lost as to what our U.S. interests are or how they're coalescing. I know what I would recommend, but I think that will have a major impact on how we will be able to interface, and maybe I see opportunity in Putin's departure.
Thank you, Mr. Watts. Senator Feinstein.
Oh, thank you, Senator Risch. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your testimony. I'm sorry I was out to vote while I missed some of it, but I've been on this committee for 16 years, and the Intelligence Community Report, which is the report of all of our major intelligence agencies, which was released on January the 6th, is among the strongest I've read. It covers the motivation and the scope of Russia's actions regarding our elections, as well as the cyber tools and the media campaigns they use to influence public opinion. The report makes a key judgment, and here it is. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the United States presidential election. the consistent goals of which were to undermine public faith in the United States democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, and harm her electability and potential presidency. It further assesses that, and these are quotes, Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump. Here's 2 questions. Do you believe the intelligence community assessment accurately characterized the goals of Russian influence activities in the election? And I'd like to go down the line with a yes or no answer. If you want to explain it, that would be fine. Who would like to go first?
Thank you for a difficult question. I personally don't find myself at odds with the ICA study that you identified. However, the statement that this was developed in 2016 needs to be parsed a bit. The Russians could not do this if they started in 2016. They wouldn't have had the capability. It's in the active measures world, one can want to do many things, but one has to have the means to do this as well.
When would you estimate it was started by your statement?
Well, it's not I have a specific date, but that one needs to have an infrastructure abroad to be able to do this. Now, you can use some of the infrastructure in your own country, especially with cyber capabilities, but
Which they had.
which they had. But active measures usually involves people as well as machines. And it would be extraordinary if they hadn't prepared a lot of the ground to be able to do this, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. They have this apparatus, and this apparatus is well-staffed, well-trained. The training of the people who work in this apparatus is quite surprising to us. We've known about it, but we don't really sort of take it very seriously. It's not 3 months or 6 months training or a year's training. They have much longer training periods, and some of them are pretty good. Not 10 feet tall, of course, but pretty good.
Okay, I got the point. Next person?
Yes.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yes, and I can give you the timeline of their development if you would like it.
Please.
We have accounts dating back to 2009 that are tied to active measures. 2014 was their capability development based on my assessment, where they started working on their influence campaigns. 2015 was when they tied hacking and influence together for the first time, specifically during the DNC breaches. I was notified in November of 2015 that I had been targeted by a cyber attack. 2016 was the push into the U.S. audience landscape to build audience. August 2016 was when I witnessed them pushing towards the election, and that was in full, August of 2015 all the way through 2016. So a 1-year build-up to the election.
Thank you. Has Russia ever, I think I know the answer to this, but if you would elaborate on it, conducted other similar campaigns in other countries to this level of impact with the goal of tilting the playing field to increase one candidate's chance of winning? Mr. Watts, if you'd go first.
Yes, I would believe you need to look back to 2014 in both Ukraine and another Eastern European country that's escaping me. In 2015-16, the Brexit campaign should be examined. I can't prove it one way or another. And then today, all of the European elections that they're choosing to meddle in: France, Germany, Netherlands, Czech Republic.
Thank you. Would you like to respond?
Yes, they have conducted such campaigns in Ukraine in 2004 and 2014. In Georgia, they've intervened heavily in domestic political campaigns in the Baltic states, so there are ample examples of that.
Thank you. Would you please respond, Doctor?
Yes, they have a history of doing this well before this, and they find it a successful use of their resources, so it is not surprising.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Senator
Thank you.
Feinstein. Senator Rubio.
Thank you all for being here. I'm concerned that in our inquiry, and I certainly think it's important for us to know what happened, we are focusing so much on the tactics that we're not focusing on the broader strategy that's at play here. I want to briefly go through a number of instances and have the panel comment on whether or not they believe these are indicative of the efforts that are being targeted against the United States and the rest of the world by Vladimir Putin. We all know that Angela Merkel has taken a tough line on Ukraine against Russia. We know that there's a lot of controversy in Germany around migrants. In early 2016, a 13-year-old known only as Lisa F., a dual Russian-German citizen whose family had moved to Germany from Russia in 2004, told police she had been kidnapped in East Berlin by what appeared to be Middle Eastern migrants and raped for over 30 hours. There was outrage in Germany and obviously protests against Merkel. The Russian foreign minister almost immediately jumped on the story, talking about the need to defend our Lisa, quote unquote, and of course this story was spread far and wide by Russian-speaking entities and Russian media outlets. Subsequently, the prosecutors in Berlin announced that they had clear evidence that during those 30 hours she was missing, Lisa F. was actually, in fact, with people that she knew, and a medical examination showed that she had not been the victim of a rape. Earlier this year, a little-known news outlet published on a website an article that claimed that the United States was deploying 3,600 tanks to Eastern Europe to prepare for war with Russia. 3,600 tanks would represent about 40% of our entire tank force. Within days, the story was republished by dozens of outlets in the United States and throughout Europe. As it turns out, the truth is we deployed 87 tanks. There is, in going all the way back to September 11th of 2015, residents in Louisiana awoke to a message, many of them did, on their Twitter feed that said, "Toxic fume hazard warning in this area until 1:30 p.m. Take shelter, check local media, and ColumbiaChemical.com." On Twitter accounts, there were hundreds of accounts documenting a disaster right down the road from the people. One account said, "A powerful explosion heard from miles away happened at a chemical plant in Centerville, Louisiana." A man named John Merritt tweeted. Anna Rusella shared an image of flames engulfing the plant. At KSarah12 posted a video of surveillance footage from a local gas station capturing the explosion. Another Twitter account posted a screenshot of CNN's homepage showing the story had already made national news, claiming that ISIS had claimed credit for the attack, according to one YouTube video. A woman named @Zopok9, Anna McLaren is her name, I guess, tweeted at Karl Rove, "Karl, is this really ISIS responsible for the hashtag Colombian chemicals? Tell Obama we should bomb Iraq." Had anyone had taken the trouble to check CNN, as this article in the New York Times outlines, there was no such attack. It was a hoax, not some simple prank, as the article goes on to say, but a highly coordinated disinformation campaign involving dozens of fake accounts that posted hundreds of tweets for hours, targeting a list of figures precisely chosen to generate maximum attention. The perpetrators didn't just doctor screenshots from CNN, and I'm reading from the New York Times article. They also created functional clones of the websites of the Louisiana TV stations and the like. The list goes on and on. We should fully document it in our report to the American people. A false story spreading claiming that Germany's oldest church had been burnt down by 1,000 Muslims chanting Allah Akbar. Another story claiming that the European Union was planning to ban snowmen as racist. All of this, and we should begin to document them for the American people. Isn't this the larger problem? Let me just rephrase that. Aren't we in the midst of a blitzkrieg, for lack of a better term, of informational warfare conducted by Russian trolls under the command of Vladimir Putin, designed to sow instability, pit us against each other as Americans? The same article, I don't have enough time, it goes on, they posted false stories about a police shooting in Atlanta that never happened, about a series of things. In essence, are we in danger here because we are focused on a very important tactical move that happened in the election of 2016 to miss the broader point? And that is that this is a coordinated effort across multiple spectrums to sow instability and to pit Americans against one another, politically, socioeconomically, demographically, and the like.
So I think the two lines of effort you brought up there that the Russians use are social dynamics that they play on, ethnic divisions, and global calamity or inciting fear. These two lines haven't been discussed much. The third one is financial. They oftentimes put out fake stories about U.S. companies, which then cause stock dips, which allow all sorts of predatory trading and other things to happen. We've focused on disinformation around the political scene, but misinformation across the board, particularly from the Russian propaganda networks, has incited fear inside the United States on multiple occasions, as you noted. One last year was there was a JFK terminal shut down about alleged gunshots. We watched social media trolls and gray outlets pump fake stories out, which ramped up that fear, which caused mass panic. So they have created the ability by gaining audience in the United States to steer Americans unwittingly in many different directions that can cause all sorts of danger and even violence in certain cases. I think the Pizzagate scandal that we saw last fall is another such example of misinformation, maybe not attributed to Russia, but we have a problem writ large right now with our information sources.
Senator Rubio, do you want to?
No, I just-
further?
Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head, and I don't really have a lot to add to it. We are faced with a strategic attack. It's not a kinetic attack usually. It's a political attack. And then the question comes, what sort of strategic response are we going to be able to develop to that? And we could elaborate on that.
Senator Warner.
Again, thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Dr. Rumor, I want to start with you. We've heard a lot recently about the role of Oleg Deripaska, the head of Russia's largest aluminum company, and the role he may have played in helping to support the goals of President Putin. Can you characterize Mr. Deripaska's role in this area? And then more broadly, are there any of the oligarchs in Russia, at least those not in exile, that aren't somehow caught up in the Kremlin's foreign policy activities? Are there any of them that are truly independent?
Thank you, Senator Warner. I can't add anything to the conversation about Mr. Deripaska beyond what's appeared in the public domain. So I don't think I have any special insights here. You know, I feed off the same reporting that's appeared in the papers. I would be careful to describe all Russian oligarchs and oligarch itself as a fairly ill-defined term. There's sort of a handful of some of those prominent ones, but it's a much bigger class of major Russian businessmen. I would be reluctant to describe them all as, you know, tools of the Kremlin. Obviously, Russian businessmen who do business in Russia have to be mindful of Kremlin political preferences, and the Kremlin has considerable influence over them. But I can't speak from concrete information about them being, you know, directly instruments of the Kremlin foreign policy. That's not something that I have evidence to back up. So I think I'll stop at that.
Okay. Mr. Watts, one of the things that your testimony, I've been talking a lot about the use of the internet trolls and their ability to then exponentially gain more power through creating these botnets. I'd love you to kind of comment about what we can do to preclude that on a going forward basis, and perhaps you can explain this technique better than I have in my various public statements.
Sure. The first thing that I think we need to understand is it's not all automated and it's not all human. There's a combination of the two. So you have a series of humans that work in their psychological warfare groups that command both bots at the same time. And I like to, as an analogy, you can look at it like artillery. So you have someone who's engaging with you as an individual, and at the same time, they can launch a bot to amplify that story forward. When we watch...
Obviously, the bot, for those ability for a computer to take over other computers that are not being used and, in fact, magnify the number of hits they might hit to a particular social media site, correct?
Exactly. Or you can create more personas in Twitter, for example, which makes it look like there are more people than there really are. It's a Potemkin village strategy, essentially, that amplifies your appearance. So what they do is they launch those simultaneously as they begin the engagement or push of false news stories, usually from RT and Sputnik News. They do that in unison, which games the social media system such that such a high volume of content being pushed at the same time raises that into the trends that you'll see. If you looked at Facebook or Twitter or whatever it might be, you would see the top 10 stories that are out right now. It pushes that up there. As soon as it pushes that into that top 10 feed, mainstream media outlets then are watching that, and they start to examine that content. So for example, the Incirlik attack I talked about, one of the key hashtags they pushed is media. The goal is to get that into the top of Twitter streams so that mainstream media has to respond to that story. When mainstream media responds to it or just looks at it without even commenting on it, it takes over organically, and you'll see it move around the internet like a virus.
One thing, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on this afternoon, there have been reports that their ability to target this information, some reports at least saying that in the last week of the campaign in certain precincts in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there was so much misinformation coming, talking about Hillary Clinton's illnesses or Hillary Clinton stealing money from the State Department or other, that completely blanked out any of the back and forth that was actually going on in the campaign. One of the things that seems curious is, would the Russians on their own have that level of sophisticated knowledge about the American political system if they didn't at least get some advice from someone in America?
Yes, I know this from working on influence campaigns in the counterterrorism context. If you do an appropriate target audience analysis on social media, you can actually identify an audience in a foreign country or in the United States, parse out all of their preferences. Part of the reason those bios had conservative, Christian, America, all those terms in it is those are the most common ones. If you inhale all the accounts of people in Wisconsin, you identify the most common terms in it. You just recreate accounts that look exactly like people from Wisconsin. So that way, whenever you're trying to socially engineer them and convince them that the information is true, it's much more simple because you see somebody and they look exactly like you, even down to the pictures. When you look at the pictures, it looks like an American from the Midwest or the South or Wisconsin or whatever the location is. And they will change those. They can reprogram them. Where they tend to show their hand is, the problem is once they build an audience, they don't want to get rid of it. So you'll see them build an audience and try and influence one segment, let's say, of the English-speaking media, and then they will reprogram it to try and influence a different story. It's the same problem any cable news outlet would have. Once you build an audience and you change your content to some other topic, you still want to keep your old audience, or otherwise you can't gain any traction.
And again, my time's up, but I just want to know, this can be used, it was used in 2016 towards one candidate, but obviously Russia's interests are Russia's interests.
Well, it's used right now against people on both sides of the aisle. So we will watch them play both sides. They might go after a Republican person in this room tomorrow, and then they'll switch. It's solely based on what they want to achieve in their own landscape, whatever the Russian foreign policy objectives are. So if they want to achieve one candidate, but let's say President Trump, for example, wins and now turns against, they will turn on President Trump as well. They win because they play both sides, and the audience will go with them once they have them.
I do know that the vice chairman hates Russia, just to make that public. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Godson, you made the point that the Russians don't always win with their active measures, and you mentioned the period of the 1940s and the 1950s. In your judgment, how successful have the Russians been in the last year in achieving their goal of sowing doubt, polarization, trying to disrupt and cast doubt on the validity of the election, putting aside the issue for the moment of the critical question of whether there was any collusion between any campaign and the Russian efforts?
Well, from the information that we have in the public sector and the private sector, I would say that they must be rather pleased with the results of their investment, whatever date they started to develop this campaign. I think, though, however, and the fact is that they are seeming to prepare to do the same thing in other campaigns abroad. And so sort of looking at the way they've behaved over the long course of time that they've used active measures, I think they will continue to do this and to reap some benefits from it, unless there is a considerable response from the democratic societies. And at the moment, I would say that our response is too restrained, and that unless they see that there is a cost to this that makes this not a very attractive thing to do, I don't see why they won't continue it. I hope that's responsive.
Thank you. Dr. Rummer, Mr. Watts made the point that the Russians will go after either side, that they're trying to disrupt society, cast doubt on Western democracies. And one largely overlooked part of the Intelligence Committee's the Intelligence Community's report last fall was information in the annex that suggested that Russia Today, which most people view as an organ of the Russian government, was instrumental in trying to advance the protests of Occupy Wall Street. Could you comment on that? And is that an example of Russia working to promote the far left versus the far right that we hear so much about?
Yes, ma'am. It's a perfect example in that Occupy Wall Street was a genuine movement on the left, but it certainly serves the interests of Russian propaganda to play it up as a major challenge, as something representing a major fault line in our society, because it drives the message that the United States is in decline, the United States is in crisis, plays up to audiences at home in Russia and abroad, that the United States is not the perfect society, something that they really like to emphasize. So that's an excellent example, and I think it deserves the attention that you, the spotlight that you cast on it. Mr. Watts referred to the minor protests outside our base in Incirlik in Turkey. Well, there's another example that there was a protest, but again, it's blown out of all proportions. And as you know, the best propaganda is that which has a grain of truth to it, then gets played up and up and up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me say thank you to our witnesses. Gentlemen, here's where we are now. The American people are worried about what's ahead with regard to Russia. The public now gets most of its information from leaks, from daily press stories, and apparently inaccurate tweets from the president. This feeds distrust and causes Americans to question the legitimacy of our government. So I believe the committee needs to lift the fog of secrecy about what really happened to our democracy. That's why it's so important we have open hearings with the Intelligence Committee, the FBI, Homeland Security, and Treasury. And I believe a key to a successful investigation is following the money. Yesterday, I wrote a letter to the chairman and the vice chair urging the committee look into any and all financial relationships between Russia and Donald Trump and his associates. I'm also taking this issue on as a ranking member of the Finance Committee, of which Senator Burr and Senator Warner are also members. I and other members of the Finance Committee have already urged that the committee exercise its authority to obtain and review Donald Trump's tax returns. This review ought to include the Trump Organization and its partnerships. Senate investigators should also look into any violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which ensures that investors are not paying bribes overseas. The Treasury Department is responsible for other programs and investigations that may uncover suspicious financial activities by Donald Trump and his associates. It is already a matter of public record that entities associated with Donald Trump have been the subject of millions of dollars of fines for willful, repeated, and long-standing violations of anti-money laundering laws. Information about Donald Trump's finances, his family, and his associates may lead to Russia. We know that in 2008, the president's son said that Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. Since then, we've gotten mostly smoke and mirrors. The committee needs to follow the money wherever it leads, because if money laundering, corruption of any kind, or fishy real estate deals point to the Russian oligarchs and criminal elements, then the Russian government may only be a step or two away from us. So now, my question. There is an extraordinary history of money laundering in Russia. Billions of dollars from corruption and other illegal activities have been moved out of the country. What that means is that Russia's corruption problem may also be our corruption problem. So here's my question for the three of you as experts on Russia. I'd like you three to tell us about corruption in Russia so as to help us follow the money in our investigation. And here's my specific question. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Watts. How can the committee track this fuzzy line between the Russian oligarchs, Russian organized crime, and the Russian government?
Thanks, Senator. I would first start off with, I'm not the foremost Russian expert. I came to this through the Islamic State and ISIS. I'm really a counterterrorism person for the most part, and came to Active Measures mostly because Active Measures came after me. The second part that I would add to this discussion, though, is there is a money trail to be searched for and discovered. And we've focused very heavily on elites in our public discussion. What are elite people doing? But this influence action has both a virtual component and a physical component that's happened. I would say that what I can't see, which I would want to know, is what is happening in Eastern Europe. There's a disproportionate number of fake news outlets, conspiratorial websites that are run from there that are English-speaking editors that are pro-Russian, trained in Russia sometimes. How are they funded? That would be one component. My guess or my estimate, my hypothesis working in the intelligence field is that there is some sort of Russian intel asset that is funding them in one way or another through some sort of scheme. The other part that I think we should be looking at is follow the trail of dead Russians. There's been more dead Russians in the past 3 months that are tied to this investigation who have assets in banks all over the world. They are dropping dead even in Western countries. We've seen arrests in, I believe it's Spain, and different computer security companies that are based in Russia, which provide services to the United States. These are all huge openings to understand how they are funded by the Russian government. I don't have the capability to do that from where I sit, but I think that's a huge angle. If you can prove that part of it, I have to say on the influence side, we can see it. The one thing that's been misconstrued in the public discussion about Russian influence is that it's covert. You can hack stuff and be covert, but you can't influence and be covert. You have to ultimately show your hand. And that's why we've been able to discover it online. But the missing part is, how did they conduct this influence? There are newspapers, there are media outlets. The Balkans are littered right now with these sorts of outlets, and that's where I would start to dig on the financial space.
I'm almost out of time. Dr. Rumer, same thing. This fuzzy line is what I'm particularly interested in. Organized crime, oligarchs, and the government. I heard you talk about one person. You couldn't comment on him, but just give me your analysis about this fuzzy line, because I keep coming back to that.
Well, sir, it is definitely a fuzzy line, and I think those relationships are probably best discussed not in an open session, because...
But you're saying they ought to be discussed.
I believe they ought to be discussed.
Good. Fair enough.
But I do believe that it is something for our intelligence community to take up rather than for us
I
to discuss in open.
probably ought to quit while I'm ahead.
Senator Blunt.
Mr. Chairman, can Mr. Godson just finish that question?
Dr. Godson, quickly. Turn your mic on.
I'm very pleased that you're having this open session. I think it's very useful. But I do think that this is a sensitive subject, and so that
Fine.
it will require skill and care on the part of our society, so we don't overreact, which in our history we sometimes have, to being surprised. And so I do think it's, there was more time to discuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blunt. Thank you.
Dr. Godson, let's just start right there. Why do you think I've got about 4 questions, so they don't need to be exhaustive, and I can follow up with more written questions later. And Mr. Watson, I'm going to come to you next. Why do you think there was this element of surprise? I mean, this is not new Russian activity in other places in the world. I think Mr. Watson said it had to start before 2016, but it does seem that the intel community, the U.S. government, the media is surprised that they have this level of involvement. You just said we shouldn't have been surprised. Why do you think we were surprised?
Well, I do think it has something to do with our culture, that we don't expect people to behave in this particular way. We've been surprised many times in our history, so I don't think it's
We expected to do it everywhere else, but not do it here?
Well, we just are sort of surprised when somebody takes a concerted effort to be involved in our affairs. We know that sometimes this happens abroad, but we don't really sort of think this is a major tool or instrument that people use. And so we found ourselves surprised in the 40s and the 70s and the 80s and so on. And so I'm not too surprised we are surprised.
Mr. Watts, why do you think we seem to have been so unready for this?
One, our intelligence community has been over-focused on terrorism and the Islamic State, and there wasn't much resources or bandwidth to focus on it. The second one is our traditional methods for detecting and counterintelligence, things like active measures, are based on humans. We run spies versus counter-spies. Most of this influence came online. They essentially duplicated the old active measures system without setting foot inside the United States. I think the third part of it is the intel community in the United States is very biased against open source information, and they've been surprised repeatedly. ISIS, the Arab Spring, you can go back over the past 6 to 7 years. We worry a lot about security clearances and badges and who gets access to doors and does the break room have a shredder, but when it comes to the open source, we miss what's right in front of our nose. My 2 colleagues and I use 3 laptops, and we do this at our house. But for some reason, the entire Intel apparatus with billions of dollars will miss a tweet or a Facebook post that's right in front of them, but will be highly focused on this security system and these closed sources, which are super useful, but we've not changed that orientation in our Intel community.
Mr. Rummer, in Europe, do you think the interventions there were so obviously different that we wouldn't have caught on, or how do you see the difference in what the Russians have done, particularly in the last 15 years in Europe, and what they did here?
Well, there was an element of unpreparedness on our part. I agree with my colleagues. I would say that, well, I can speak from personal experience, and that is I just didn't believe that any one intervention, any one agent can swing our election across 50 states. I thought nobody in the right mind would try to take on the challenge of such expense and complexity. But then when you think about it more carefully, as we have now with the benefit of hindsight, if you look at the election of 2000, when the Florida vote was decided by a very small number of votes, when we now know some of the votes were decided, in some states were decided by a very small margin, you realize that, you know, a more sophisticated actor that has, as my colleagues have pointed out, years and decades of experience of playing in this field can actually aspire to make a meaningful difference.
Let me ask another question about that. I know the Vice Chairman mentioned hand counting of ballots in the recent elections in one European country. You said that the Russian intelligence services directly intervened. We don't have any reason to believe, any of you can answer this, that they intervened in any election counting system this time. I think we should be concerned that that never be allowed to happen, and one of our goals here should be to be sure we're protecting that part of the process. But when you said directly intervened in the elections, no indication, Mr. Rumor, of directly intervening anywhere in the counting of votes on Election Day?
Right. There are public statements from our intelligence community and law enforcement and DHS that our counting systems have not been affected. I can only go on the strength of that, and I fully believe that statement. But we certainly should be aware of that and concerned about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to start out by just thanking the Chairman and the Vice Chairman for their willingness to work so closely together on leading this investigation. I certainly think that today's hearing is helpful in setting a baseline for the intentions and the techniques of Russia's active measures campaigns, but I also look forward to public hearings in which we can dig even deeper into the substance of what happened specifically in the 2016 election. Similarly, I believe it's critical that we dig into the financial aspects involved and that we follow the money to determine whether and how the Russians have used financial leverage to achieve their strategic goals. I think we need to do everything possible to get to the truth. The American people certainly deserve no less. And I think if we do not take this seriously, it is not hyperbolic to say that our fundamental democratic institutions are at risk. Dr. Godson said something in his statement for the record about the history of relying on agents of influence. In other words, recruiting and co-opting sympathetic groups or individuals in the U.S. and in the West to advance the Russian agenda. Do you all agree that financing is one of the methods often used by Russia to recruit sympathetic agents?
Yes.
Yes, there's publicly available evidence of Moscow-based bank financing one of the presidential candidates in France.
So when they use financial resources to recruit agents of influence, like the example you just made, is it always a simple of exchange of money for assistance, or does Russia sometimes attempt to buy influence more subtly through access to lucrative business deals and contracts and those kinds of arrangements?
Yes, I think all of the above we can show examples of in the past.
Yes, they have used their considerable financial business leverage in Eastern Europe to cut favorable energy deals, to offer lucrative deals to local companies and governments.
I think the key point in this is comparing it to Soviet active measures to today is we didn't do business transactions with the Soviet Union. So they have so many more access points to compromise people financially or to influence them on the financial space that they couldn't have done during the Cold War.
This next question is for any of you. I'm curious if you see money in politics as an opening for Russia to be able to potentially manipulate our elections, especially given their expertise at moving financial resources through networks and the change in our own environment in which there is now a lack of transparency in the current U.S. campaign finance environment, where oftentimes you have elections where a majority of the dollars spent are not even originating from the individual candidates themselves. Have any of you given that some thought?
So I think it's a little bit overstated based on the public part of it. The Russians aren't stupid. They know that if they are ever caught directly putting money into what looks like a Manchurian candidate kind of scenario, this could be provocation for war, or it could be sanctions. It could be a host of different things. At the same point, I would also offer you, from an intelligence perspective, why not look at it as a way to compromise somebody? So if you have a candidate that's doing well, and you have very open campaign finance, why not slip them some money where they don't know the original source of it, such that if it's revealed later, they are discredited? So it can go both ways. It's not just promotion. It can also be used as a tool and a weapon.
You, Mr. Watts, I think did a really good job of laying out for us how these influence operations actually have the impact of sort of organically changing the trends on media and end up being sort of a self-reinforcing mechanism. Are there analytic or digital tools that can discount the impact of those bots and of that manufactured forcing mechanism within the way that information travels on the web today and impacts the media?
So I think all the social media companies are starting to realize that their ad revenue mechanisms can be manipulated for this. There are more than just Russian fake news out there. You've got profiteers, you've got political groups that do that, and you've got, satire, which is thrown in the mix of it. You're seeing the social media companies try and regulate this now or deem things as fake news, but that's going to fail. Ultimately, any attempt to deem things as fake or not fake is going to lead to freedom of speech violations, freedom of the press violations. Because how do you do that? How do you determine who's being fair or not? I think a better way to do it, and what we propose, is to create the version of Information Consumer Reports, which is an independent agency which is funded by the social media companies, has no government involvement, no government funding, that provides a rating in terms of the news that shows up on your feed, such that, much like nutrition labels on food, you know what you're consuming. Right now, part of the reason this is so effective is a fake news outlet can pop up one day, pump out stories that are sensational, and fall down the next. The consumer, an American, on their Facebook feed, which is curated to the things that they like to click on, and even in their Google searches, which is curated to things other people like to click on like them, end up clicking on these things because they're popular. If they had a score or a rating, some sort of symbol there that said, you're more than welcome to click on this, but this is the National Enquirer, you can evaluate how much of it is truth and how much is manipulated truth and how much is false. And just like we saw with Consumer Reports when I was growing up, it had 15 variables. It's rated over time, and it becomes a trusted integer that you can go to. I think that's a better way to do it. We're not restricting Americans' freedom of speech and press, and at the same point, where if they want to look at fake news, they can look at it, but they know what they're getting into.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Langford.
It's hard to believe we're even having this hearing today discussing this topic, since Putin already cleared this up earlier today. He came out with a public statement just hours ago saying, "Watch my lips, no," and then followed up with, "All these things are fictional, illusory, provocations, lies, used for domestic American political agendas. The anti-Russian card is played by different political forces inside the United States to trade on and consolidate their positions inside." Well, he certainly consolidated us. It is painful to watch the Russian people trapped in a regime that is doing this worldwide. They'd like to be able to watch the Olympics and know their athletes weren't doped ahead of time. They would like to believe their own news when the Russians proclaim, "We're not in Ukraine and we're not in Syria," and they are, and it'd be nice if we could, as he said, watch my lips and know that he's not trying to deceive our audiences. My question is, first, why did he think he could get away with it this time? This is not new for the Russians. They've done this for a long time across Europe, but it was much more engaging this time in our election. Why now? Mr. Watts?
I think this answer is very simple and is what no one is really saying in this room, which is part of the reason active measures have worked in this U.S. election is because the commander-in-chief has used Russian active measures at time against his opponents. On 14 August 2016, his campaign chairman, after a debunked Incirlik...
When you say his, who's his?
Paul Manafort,
Okay.
Cited the fake Incirlik story as a terrorist attack on CNN, and he used it as a talking point. On 11 October, President Trump stood on a stage and cited what appears to be a fake news story from Sputnik News that disappeared from the internet. He denies the intel from the United States about Russia. He claimed that the election could be rigged. That was the #1 theme pushed by RT, Sputnik News, white outlets, all the way up until the election. He's made claims of voter fraud, that President Obama is not a citizen, that, Congressman Cruz is not a citizen. So part of the reason active measures works, and it does today in terms of Trump Tower being wiretapped, is because they parrot the same lines. So Putin is correct. He can say that he's not influencing anything because he's just putting out his stance. But until we get a firm basis on fact and fiction in our own country, get some agreement about the facts, whether it be, do I support the intelligence community or a story I read on my Twitter feed, we're going to have a big problem. I can tell you right now today, gray outlets that are Soviet-pushing accounts tweet at President Trump during high volumes when they know he's online, and they push conspiracy theories. So if he is to click on one of those or cite one of those, it just proves Putin correct, that we can use this as a lever against the Americans.
So this started in 2008-9 time period, as you've cited before with your previous timeline. Even before this rose up, even when there were 16 Republican candidates on the stage, this was a long time coming, and it seemed to be very well organized this time. Part of my question is, I get that completely. Why this time? They look to be more prepared, probing, evaluating states, trying to get into voter records, trying to be more active in the process.
They have plausible deniability. If you wanted to run this during the Cold War, you would have had to put agents inside the United States. They would have been stalked by counterintelligence professionals. They would have been run down. You couldn't have gained an audience on a communist newspaper, for example. Today, you can create the content, gain the audience, build the bots, pick out the election and even the voters that are valued the most in swing states, and actually insert the right content in a deliberate period. They pre-planned it. They were based a year and a half out. They're doing it today on the European elections. And here's the other thing that needs to come up. They try all messages. We've been very focused on, our presidential election. The Republicans, tend to come up. But the Democrats, they were there too. They were with Bernie Sanders supporters trying to influence them in different directions. So they play all sides. They much like I learned in infantry school about how they use artillery. They fire artillery everywhere, and once they get a break in the wall, that's where they swarm in and they focus. And they do that very well today. You'll see them in Europe supporting people on the left or right, whichever will dismantle the democratic function that they're after. So I think the important point moving forward is we have to educate our public and even our institutions. And the mainstream media is right to be taking some on the chin right now. They've fallen for a lot of these fake news stories. They've amplified it, and they've not gone back and done good fact-checking. The media needs to improve. Our U.S. government institutions need to improve, and we got to help Americans understand what the facts are, because if we don't, we are lost. We will become 2 separate, maybe 3 separate worlds in the United States, just because of this little bitty pinprick that was put in by a foreign country.
Which is their goal on that, Mr. Chairman? I yield back.
Senator Manchin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I want to thank Senator King for allowing me. I have another meeting I've got to attend, but I wanted to ask this question. I've been around long enough to remember that my school desk at home protected me if I jumped underneath of it, held my head during the nuclear attack from Russia. I'm not sure that my United States Senate desk, if I jump underneath of it and hold my head, will protect me this time. And that's putting it mildly. With that being said, much has been written about the new hybrid style of warfare practiced by the Russians recently in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine. To be brief, Russia believes the lines between war and peace are blurred. Wars are no longer declared and no longer fought in a traditional manner. And the power of non-military means to achieve objectives exceeds the power of weapons and effectiveness. Some label it the Gerasimov doctrine, which is a combination of political, military, economic, social, and media means to achieve Russian strategic objectives. In the United States, we would call this a whole of government approach. So my question would be to any of you, and I'll start with you, Mr. Watts, if possible, is Russia's meddling in our 2016 elections proof the United States is dealing with a nation that is acting in its own warlike manner?
Yes. Would you like me to comment on some of the things we can do? Yeah, so there are 7 or 8 things we could do immediately that are not very complicated.
And my desk is not going to save me this time, right?
No, and I'll tell you right now, I'm going to walk out of here today. I'm going to be cyber attacked. I'm going to be discredited by trolls. My biggest fear isn't being on Putin's hit list. or psychological warfare targeting. I've been doing that for 2 years. My biggest concern right now is I don't know what the American stance is on Russia and who's going to take care of me. I mean, after years in the Army and the FBI, working in the intel communities today, I'm going to walk out of here and ain't nobody going to be covering my back. I'm going to be on my own. And so that's very disconcerting. And I think that speaks to what we need to do. One, in terms of falsehoods, we need to do 2 things. We need a State Department and a DHS website that immediately refute when falsehoods are put out. These seem silly when they come out. Incirlik, terrorist attack, for example. But the quicker they're refuted, the faster they die in social media. We caught the Incirlik attack because it was refuted quickly. When the Russians fake it, it gets exposed. If it goes on too long, it gets into mainstream media and it runs out of control. The other part is the FBI. They're doing a great job in terms of investigating hacking, but the hacking powers influence. Whenever there's a hack, we should immediately go in and look at what was stolen and figure out what is the anticipated smear campaign discrediting, how is this going to be weaponized and influenced. The next one I think is super important, which is educating U.S. businesses. Treasury and Commerce right now need to be doing awareness campaigns. Their companies suffer smear campaigns from foreign countries right now, which change their stock prices. Their employees are in social media and are being picked off through social engineering and hacked at. The other part really is in the private sector and the public sector that we need to look at. Mainstream media companies, we need to be working with them. What if they boycotted WikiLeaks collectively? What if they all didn't race to publish too quickly? If those damaging, stolen information that is misconstrued oftentimes doesn't get into the mainstream media, if all of them block it out, Russia's influence dies on the vine. And the last thing I think is the social media companies. Whether we like it or not, social media has become the news provider for almost all Americans. Our preferences shape what we see, and our friends share stuff with us, and it reinforces our views. And so I think that for them, they're worried about these state-sponsored groups in their systems and how it's going to erode their company.
Dr. Gordon, I'd like to ask you, if possible, when the Iron Curtain fell and Russia fell out of the world power status, superpower status, I might say, how long was that hiatus? And when it came back, did it come back with a vengeance because of Putin's leadership and determination not to be shelved? Turn your mic on, sir.
I wish we knew, had more information about, about this. Some areas we know a lot, and some areas...
Well, do you all see basically a drop-off of their, during the 90s? When
we do see a bit of a drop-off, yes. However, the training and the development of cadre continues. The hierarchy wasn't well established in terms of controlling all the various aspects.
Was it under Putin, basically, all this came back? Can anybody say that, Dr.
Yes.
Rumer?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. In the 1990s, Russia was flat on its back. It just didn't have the resources, and a lot of the capital in this area that it had accumulated basically fell apart. I think they were very, very frustrated during the Balkan Wars when they really couldn't counter what they saw as our information domination of the airwaves. So in the early 2000s, when their economy came back, the apparatus came back with it too. Could I just add one?
Could I just ask one thing, because my time is running out here? Under Putin, do you believe it's impossible to build a relationship to basically bring this back into some type of civility or order? Is it he's just absolutely, totally committed the direction he's been going and will continue to go no matter what?
Can I just add an answer to that quickly? It depends on what the costs are. In other words, what are we going to do in response?
So he only reacts out of power, strength. He only reacts back out of strength, if we have the strength.
Well, most of us react to power and strength too, but in this case, we don't yet have enough information. I mean, the committee and the study that you're doing is very important for us, not just scholars and studying this subject. It's very important because we can't really answer the question about why this time and why it's successful. We're not even sure what happened here. Now, we have the ICA statement of January, but I just sort of want to put in a note of caution here. We sometimes in the United States think we know things, and we have a sort of group think, and we all express certain views. And then we find out that later on maybe the sources of our evidence, the way we put the evidence together, didn't really make as much sense as we thought it did at the time. Now, we've had that in our recent experience. I mean, in the 90s and 2002 and 3, and so on. So I would just say we need a little bit of caution here to be able to know exactly what happened. There's so much information out in the real and false and mixture.
So I want to thank you so much. I've really exceeded my time. They've been so kind to me, but thank you.
Senator Cotton.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance this morning. I want to return to the topic Senator Langford broached, which is why Vladimir Putin and Russia's leaders thought they could get away with such a brazen set of actions last year, and doing so in a, quote, noisy fashion, as Director Comey testified last week. Dr. Godson, I'd like to hear your point of view on this, and specifically I'd like to hear your thoughts about the context in which Vladimir Putin did this in 2015 and 2016. In the previous 8 years, Russia had invaded Georgia, it had invaded and seized Crimea, its rebels had been supported and backed in eastern Ukraine to occupy the Donbas. They'd been provided missiles that had shot a civilian aircraft out of the sky. Russia had repeatedly violated the INF Treaty, and the Obama administration had come into office proclaiming a reset, and then in 2012, Barack Obama mocked his opponent for claiming that Russia was our #1 foe and promised Dmitry Medvedev that more could be done after the election when he had more flexibility. Would that series of events have emboldened Vladimir Putin to think he might be able to get away with such a noisy intrusion into our political system?
Well, I would suggest that you're right. I think that this does not help in restraining Russian interests in expanding in the near abroad and as far abroad as they can. And so that the train of actions that you described there didn't exactly persuade him that we would take his intervening in other matters, such as elections, seriously. And so that it's going to take, I think, some time and some activity by the United States, some important activity to be able to establish our reputation in this arena. And I know it's beyond the sort of just the remit of the Intelligence Committee, but intelligence can play a major role in this. But I think this is a whole of government business, a policy issue, and so it's going to be more than intelligence. But I would hope, though, that we are, in fact, gaining the kinds of information we need to have an informed judgment about that you are asking about. In other words, was he tempted by our lack of action? I hope, I presume, that the intelligence community has a tasking that identifies the Soviet responses and their perceptions, and that if we don't have such a tasking on this subject, then we won't be in a very good position to ask it. But I think, in general, yes, I agree with the point you're making. I think the evidence is strong, but we need stronger information to keep us to give us a better judgment on this kind of issue.
Dr. Rumor, I don't think you've had a chance to opine on this question yet.
Thank you, sir. I believe that the biggest factor in Putin's decision to pursue this aggressive line of intervention in our domestic politics has been the realization on their part, as Mr. Watts has suggested, that this is a very lucrative environment in which they can achieve a lot with even a remotely plausible claim of deniability. So I think they just took advantage of the environment here.
Mr. Watts.
Yeah, I'd like to add two things to what I said before. One, I don't think they thought their hand was going to be exposed as much as it is today. I think they thought they could do it in a more subtle fashion. And so my belief is right now in Russia, they're probably trying to figure out how do I manage this situation now where I have extended myself. But the overriding issue with why Russia did this to the United States and does it now to Europe is we are weak. We do not respond. We have no organized response as a country or even policy towards Russia right now. So I think until we set the boundaries about how we are going to either push-pull with them, They're going to move as far as they can, pushing, and then when we set our policy positions, which we don't have right now, they'll move in kind based on whatever that is.
I have one final question about active measures. Dr. Godson, you talked in your testimony, or in your opening statement, about some of the history of Russian active measures. It's been going on for a long time. Bob Gates, former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, wrote in his first memoir, From the Shadows, about Russia's campaign against the NATO deployment of intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe in 1983. Quote, during the period, the Soviets mounted a massive covert action operation aimed at thwarting INF deployments by NATO. We at the CIA devoted tremendous resources and effort at the time to uncovering this Soviet covert campaign, end quote. The United States is currently undergoing a long-delayed, deeply needed nuclear modernization campaign, upgrading our bombers, our dual-capable aircraft, our ground-based missiles, a long-range strategic standoff cruise missile, and our submarine capability as well. Do you believe there is any chance that Russia is not currently engaged in an active measure campaign to try to thwart that modernization effort in the United States?
I think you're right. I do believe almost certainly that they are, if not already engaged in it, they will be.
Because that is simply what Russia does.
That is simply what this particular leadership, the successors to the previous generations, yes, believe and do. I don't think it's inevitable all Russians will do this, but I think these fellows will do it.
I apologize, gentlemen. My time has expired.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to sort of sum up what I've heard this morning, number one, it appears that we're engaged in a new form of aggression, if not war, that the Soviet Union and now Russia has been utilizing for many years, but is now taking it to a much higher level. It strikes me that Vladimir Putin is playing a weak hand very well. A couple of questions to try to, very, very short. I would say that what we've seen and what you've told us this morning is that what we saw in the 2016 election is absolutely consistent with prior Russian practice and current Russian practice in other parts of Europe and the world. Is that correct, Mr. Watts?
Yes, it's still going on today.
Secondly, is it your opinion that this is going to continue? In other words, 2016 is not a one-off?
No, I mean, they're going to continue until something meets their challenge. And right now, there's nothing meeting their challenge. Any European effort I've seen is very small in comparison.
And Mr. Rumer, would you say that, Dr. Rumer, that Putin is a Democrat, a Republican, or an opportunist?
I think it's he's an opportunist, and even if we counter this, or when we counter his efforts, he will continue anyway. It's going to be a dynamic, not a sort of static situation where we deploy countermeasures and that stops. It will keep going on.
I think it's very important, though, that we realize that he is neither a Democrat nor a Republican, because it means that everybody on this dais and everybody in political life in America, regardless of their party, is at risk. In 2016, it happened to tilt because of his interest toward the presidential candidate of the Republican Party, but it could very well be the opposite in 2020 or 2022. Mr. Watts, you're nodding, but I can't record that.
Yes, they will shift to whichever one supports or is most amenable to their foreign policy position, or who they think is weak for manipulation. That they will go with whichever one it is.
And one thing that was mentioned today somewhat briefly, but it came up in some of the questions, is not only did they hack the Democratic National Committee and misinformation and disinformation and all of that, but they also pushed and probed into our state election systems in a number of states. Apparently, the information that we have thus far is it didn't work, but they tried. And Mr. Watts, would you agree that they weren't trying for fun? This wasn't entertainment. They were looking for a place to make changes in election results.
What no one's talking about is the information nukes that Russia sits on right now, because they hacked 3,000 to 4,000 people. I think this afternoon you're going to hear on the cyber, more technical side, this hacking was pervasive. We've focused on the DNC. I've been targeted. Some other people have been targeted that I know. they have our information. So anytime anyone rises up that they choose against, whether it's Republican or Democrat, Congress or executive branch or a state official, they've got the ability to do the same thing they just did over the past year.
And I want to touch on that in a minute, but I do want, do you believe that they will try again to compromise state-level election voting machines, registration rolls?
They could.
That's what they tried this time.
I don't think it's about breaking into the election machines. The goal is to create the perception that the vote may not be authentic. And so that's why it's smart to target voter rolls, because just the act of hitting a voter roll doesn't change the votes, but then you can run an influence story that says there's voter fraud in the United States, that the election's rigged, that the count wasn't accurate, and you can gain traction with it. It's a pinprick perception that they're trying to create.
You've mentioned several times, and I think the Russian term is kompromat, and I think it's interesting that they have a Russian term, which is compromising information. And this is active in the sense that not only can they take things off your computer, they can put things on your computer that will compromise you. And I think that should send a shudder through all Americans that this isn't only taking, if you can be very careful in your emails, but something can show up on your computer that's fake, and you could be in a lot of trouble. This is one of their techniques, is it not?
Yes, Americans should look to Europe, where this has happened quite a bit more frequently.
And finally, we talked a bit about, you talked a bit about defenses, and I think this is something that our committee in its report is going to have to look at. Cyber strategy is one. We have no cyber strategy in this country. There's no knowledge around the world of how we will react to a cyber attack, and I think that's part of what we have to do. Digital literacy, and that is people understanding the limitations of what they have on the internet. My wife has a sign in our kitchen that says, the problem with quotes on the internet is you can't determine whether they're authentic. Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
And, you know, we have to educate our people that they can't believe everything that they read on the internet. And part of that is, I think, your very creative suggestion of a kind of Snopes, expanded Snopes to check the validity, so people at least know, okay, there's some likelihood that that is untrue. And finally, public awareness, which is what this hearing is all about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, let me start by complimenting you and the Vice Chairman again for your leadership, and it's really important. I saw Senator Langford, Senator King, thank you. I'm had a blank on TV this morning talking about why this is so important to our country and why it's so important we have a bipartisan investigation and follow the facts wherever they may lead. But Mr. Watts, let me follow up on some of what Senator King was alluding to. I remember, of course, it wasn't that long ago where the Office of Personnel Management was hacked and 21 million records, personnel records, were stolen of U.S. government workers. Of that, about 5 million plus fingerprints included. I'm also remembering that a few years ago there was a story, I think it was in 2016, a story about the tactics that Putin uses to discredit political opponents in Russia and elsewhere. The New York Times story I pulled up said, foes of Russia say child pornography is planted to ruin them. The sort of tactics that are being used both domestically and internationally against foes of the Putin administration, the sort of hacks, the cyber attacks and the access to personnel records, the computers of all of us, all of these render us susceptible to this sort of influence campaigns, correct?
Yes, Americans need to understand that anything they do on the computer can be public at some point.
And just because it appears on the computer doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
Correct. Fact and fiction have been wildly blurred over the past few years.
Regarding the last election and Putin's active measures effort, is it reasonable to conclude that any efforts made to weaken the candidacy of Hillary Clinton by doing damage to her reputation, credibility, and political standing would have been a desirable outcome for Russia, even if she were elected president?
Yes, the goal was either to get your candidate elected that you approve of, or to just totally discredit and undermine the mandate of whoever does win, should it be your opponent.
Mr. Ruber?
Yes, sir, I agree.
So do we have any reason to believe that Putin knew more than the pundits and pollsters did here in America about the outcome of the election before it occurred?
No.
The electoral result is what I'm referring to. I didn't think so. Dr. Godson, you mentioned earlier, and I believe several of you alluded to this, about a strategic approach to countermeasures. Would you briefly describe what some of those might be? And I would like to have a more extended conversation at some point about what each of you would recommend for the United States government to do to engage in a strategic approach of countermeasures to this sort of campaign. Dr. Godson?
Well, we have had a historical precedent for developing that strategic approach. This is actually what happened in the Reagan years, that we decided that we had to. It was a major active measures offensive, much higher than people had expected, and we had to respond. And so there were a couple of things that were done then which seemed to be quite effective, and I would recommend we take those things that worked and put them into our strategic approach. This will take
Could you give us a few examples?
Yeah. Well, one is what we're sort of starting to do now, and what you're starting to do is educating the American and other populations about the threat of active measures and the price one can pay for successful active measures. So that when they know and hear about it, they're not taken by it. It doesn't influence. So one is education. A second capability that we would need would be then ways of reducing the effectiveness of the active measures. First is warning, anticipating, education, and then what can be done to reduce the effectiveness of the active measures. And one of the things that worked in the past was exposing the perpetrators of the active measures, preferably in real time, but anyway, exposure.
As Mr. Watts pointed out, the advent of social media and the use of social media to move fake stories around the internet and to get mainstream media to pay attention to them, and without authenticating the source of the information, then repeating it, successfully amplifying that message, strikes me as a huge challenge. Right. All of us have run for elections and had to deal with the changes in the way we communicate with each other, and it is a huge challenge. I don't know how we get to the bottom of this and find some site, some trusted site, government or otherwise, that says this is the truth, this is not the truth. Don't believe what you're being told.
Well, we did, Senator, we did have some good experience with it. We didn't have the machines. They didn't have those capabilities, the mechanical capabilities, but we still were able to discredit a lot of their active measures and the apparatus, and so it was effective for a while. The third part of this, though, is sort of really the hard part is what kind of whole of government responses are we going to develop to actually deal with the problem? We sort of have to come to grips with this, and as I said, this may not be the only committee that has to deal with this, but we have to say, what are we willing to tolerate? Are there any red lines for us that if they go over this line, then there will be these kinds of responses? We developed this kind of deterrence policy. We have rules of the road in deterrence, so both sides don't get too close to each other on these on nuclear weapons issues. But we're going to have to start to figure out what it is we're going to do and what we're going to accept and what we're going to tolerate and what kinds of responses we're going to have, not just once in a while, but consistently in this arena. And I thank you, though, for the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Harris.
Thank you, and I want to thank the chairman and vice chairman for this open hearing. As this committee conducts its investigation into Russia's interference with our 2016 United States election, the American people need to fully understand the threat that we face and what we must do to protect ourselves in the future. And let's all be clear about what happened. We know, as has already been determined by the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, a foreign country, Russia, attacked the heart of our democracy. an American election for the President of the United States. And they can and will do so again if we do not act urgently. We must get to the bottom of this. We must be thorough, we must proceed with urgency, and we must be transparent. That is vital to protect the public's trust in us, and it's what the American people deserve. And I know we can do so while protecting classified sources and material. Items that must remain classified in order to protect our national security, the sources of our intelligence, and the sensitive methods by which we collect it. This hearing is a first step to understand Russia's interference, but it cannot end here. We must build on today's hearing with future open hearings as much as possible. And I strongly believe an informed public is one of our best weapons against future attacks. That being said, I have a question for all of you, and I'll start with Mr. Watts. Earlier this week, former President Vice President Cheney said Russia's interference in our election should be considered an act of war. Assuming this was an act of war, Russia is investing in cyber weapons and cyber soldiers, which we call trolls, while we continue to invest in conventional weapons. As we invest in fighter jets and aircraft carriers, Russia is investing in state-run media from which it can push out fake news. As we consider investing more than $600 billion in our defense budget, Russia has approximately 1/10 of that amount in their budget and is developing its cyber warfare capabilities. I strongly believe cyber may be the new frontier of war. And so my question for you is, was this an act of war? And are we prepared for this new form of warfare? And equally important, given the everyday challenges of Americans in their everyday lives, why should they be concerned about this?
On the first part, an act of war, on the scale of warfare, it's not kinetic, but it's definitely part of the Cold War system that we knew 20, 30 years ago. Americans should be concerned because right now, a foreign country, whether they realize it or not, is pitting them against their neighbor, other political parties, ramping up divisions based on things that aren't true. They're trying to break down the trust they have in you as a senator, the Congress, the legislature, the court system. They're trying to break down all faith in those institutions. And if they can do that, if Americans don't believe that their vote counts, they're not going to show up to participate in democracy. If they don't believe that what they're doing is part of a government system that actually represents them, they're not going to go to jury duty. If they don't believe in those institutions, everything breaks down. And when that breakdown occurs, we are focused internally, and Russia is focused externally, achieving their goals. In terms of investments, part of the reason we don't invest well in cyber and we don't invest in information is because we're not buying big pieces of equipment. If you can't buy a big piece of equipment, then it's really hard to invest your dollars. We need to invest in people. The reason Russians win in cyber and information space is they have great propagandists and they have the best hackers that are out there that they can either enlist because they're criminals and sort of bring under their umbrella or train themselves. We, on the other hand, worry a lot about who we're going to bring into the cyber field because they might have smoked weed one day, or they can't pass a security clearance, or they didn't get a score on their ASVAB. But there's millions, I mean millions of talented Americans out there that can support these roles inside our government. We need to invest in humans moving forward in this space. And it's hard to get Americans to understand that, or even the Department of Defense, because you're talking about cyber and computers, and so you think of tech. But the truth is that tech only works if you've got the smartest brains behind it. We do, but we don't put them against our fight.
Thank you. Dr. Romer.
I think we should be careful using terms such as an act of war. It's definitely a continuation of warfare by other means. But, when you declare something to be an act of war, it calls for certain responses that we may not be ready to take on. I do agree with Mr. Watts on the need to be much more creative and much more resourceful in a way we approach the question of, call it cyber warfare. I, again, would caution that, the Russians have a very different standard here in using their offensive tools than we use in using our cyber tools with great deal of responsibility. And I think we should be very careful not to cross certain lines. We should, however, be using tools that are available to us and platforms that are available to us, just from a somewhat different domain. I think that our own spokesman, our own information projected, delivered from our platforms should be the gold standard of accuracy and objectivity. So from that standpoint, let me just say that, we're not using, for example, the platform of the State Department effectively. The practice of not sustaining our regular briefings for the media, for the world, is something that only hurts our interests.
Thank you.
I agree with my colleagues, so I won't repeat the same conclusions they reached. I would, though, like to introduce the idea, though, that cyber is now important. Cyber wasn't considered so important 20 years ago, now considered important. But there are other technologies coming on board now. Some are visible to us. Some, they're not very salient. They haven't risen above the horizon. There are a whole number of technologies that are not internet dependent. And as we look at active measures now and into the future, I would think that would be on the agenda. I'll give just one example, virtual reality. Anybody who can set up the reality is going to have a very decided advantage in politics and other areas. And so as we're looking at cyber, and you are going to have a hearing and other studies of this, I would say just that we should broaden the concept of technologies that are going to be available, coming online, and it's be extremely unlikely that the Russians would ignore those technologies. And so maybe that would be something to add to the already busy agenda that you have. And thank you.
Thank you, Senator
Thank you.
Harris. Thank you to all of our witnesses. All the questions have been asked except for mine. So let me, if I could, spend just a couple of minutes. And I agree with you, Dr. Godson. The ability to impersonate online is the next phase that we will go through. And I think it's safe to say we don't have our best and brightest yet focused on that. We're still trying to triage what happened to us versus to be creative and look forward and say what could happen. Mr. Watts, I heard you talk about intent and specifically the intent of the Russians and their effectiveness, and how pre-planning played a large part of the 16 effort. Here's my disconnect, is that when you, at least on the surface as we've gotten into the investigation, as you look at the emails that were captured either out of the DNC or out of the Podesta account that were then the source of Russia's effort through WikiLeaks to publicly lay this out. That seemed to be an average, ordinary Russian fishing expedition that we captured maybe 3,000 efforts at the same period in time. So are you suggesting that they had an effort to mess with the elections and just happened to be lucky enough to stumble across a volume of emails?
They go widespread. Whatever are the best nuggets that come out of that is what they run with. They hit a gold mine, and they were able to successfully find the ammunition they wanted. What you see at other cases is they do compromise other accounts. I'm not going to talk about them. I don't want to amplify them, but they're less successful. You know, we'll hear dumps, and you'll be like, oh, this isn't really anything other than what I expected a politician to say. And so they hit a whale whenever they went fishing. But I would also say that somewhere in their cache right now, there's tremendous amounts of information laying around that can weaponize against other Americans.
We would agree with you on that. And very quickly, as you sort of summarized how fake news and how coordinated social media efforts push stories to the top 10 and they get picked up automatically. What is the takeaway for U.S. media outlets from what you've just said?
They have to improve their editorial processes, and they also have to take a step back from the "I got to get it out first" competitive environment. Part of the reason this Russian system works is every outlet races to get the story out first. When they do that, they put themselves at risk to fall for these sorts of schemes. And until they improve that, or until they collectively, we have some sort of standard that either the public or the media holds to itself, we're going to keep seeing them fall for these campaigns, whether it's Russia, by the way, or others.
Sure.
You're going to see many other nations take this on now. The playbook's been thrown out there.
Dr. Rumer, would you like to take the opportunity to address in greater detail what the Russians are doing in the French and German elections?
Well, sir, there's a wide effort in the German election to build up this far-right party, Alternative for Germany, ADF, to use them as sort of a credible challenger to Chancellor Angela Merkel. There are countless stories that are being spread through fake news sites, proliferating in the media about the failures of Chancellor Merkel. They, as others have pointed out, have exploited the story about the girl that was not raped, but to, again, discredit her in the eyes of the general public, so as to, point out her failure to protect Germany against the flood of refugees. That's one of the major policy initiatives that she took when the Syria crisis broke out. In the French election, we just saw something that really was staggering, and that is President Putin hosted in the Kremlin the leading far-right candidate, and almost with a smirk said that we don't interfere in French elections, but we have the right to engage any candidate in the public domain in that contest. Also, Russian disinformation sources have spread malicious stories about one of the leading candidates, Emmanuel Macron, about his personal life. So
for the first time, we're really beginning to see an effort to build up and to absolutely destroy the character of others, having a double impact on potentially on the outcome of the election.
Yes, sir.
Good. Dr. Godson, just quickly, how did we respond differently when we overcame these active measures by Russians pre-80? And is there a lesson for us to learn from that in our actions now?
I think there are a number of lessons, but one was this exposure business, that we learned how to put out information into the public domain that not only was relevant for Americans, but for foreigners. And we briefed that, and we developed teams that could go out and talk about these things, and so neutralize a lot. That was one of the methods that we could replicate. A second was support to elements abroad who are trying to maintain the democratic process. We developed some capabilities to do that. We still have some. One of the outstanding examples is the National Endowment for Democracy, bipartisan, able to do quite a lot, but is also limited in various ways. And so one could look back and see how we were able to do this in different ways abroad that had an effect in the past. It's not that expensive financially.
Sure.
And those methods are available.
Thank you. Mr. Watts, just very briefly, has anybody taken you up on your list of recommendations?
No.
Okay. That did not go unnoticed by the committee. I want you to know that. And nor did the comment that there was agreement on at the table that America's response to date has been woefully short of what it should be. If anything, it should be interpreted, and it probably was interpreted by the Russians, that they can double down and, in fact, do it unscathed. So, Mr. Watts, we heard you when you said fact and fiction have become wildly blurred. let me just assure you that this committee's mission every day is to do the oversight on the intelligence community, 17 agencies, that assures the American people we do everything within the letter of the law. We first assure that to 85 other members of the Senate. So when it came time for a look inside what Russia Active Measures did and what our response was and how our intelligence community came to the assessments that they would, this fell right in our wheelhouse. This is what our professional staff does on a daily basis. This is a little more granular than what we do. It will take some time, and it means triaging a tremendous amount of documents. But I also heard from all three of you that if there was ever a time to get it right, it's now. And we have methodically built a process that builds a foundation of fact to build an investigation on that foundation that can hopefully come to a bipartisan finding where the conclusions are matched with the facts that we find. In some cases, as all three of you know, that might be intelligence product that can't be made public. But in every place that we can, I have pledged to the Vice Chairman, and he has pledged to his members, and I have pledged to mine, where we can make it public so that the American people understand it and feel that this has been credible and thorough and that the conclusions are valid, we're going to try to do that. But I also believe that the American people expect us to protect sources and methods. They expect us to work with the intelligence community in a way that strengthens what they do and how they do it, not by sharing that with everybody, but by certifying that they're doing it within the letter of the law to keep America safe. I look at this investigation as one extension of that, and it's to once again certify to the American people what we've done has been thorough, to hopefully provide some actionable conclusions for this administration, and to look back on the work that we do and believe that in 2018, 2020, we're going to be less concerned with Russia's involvement in our elections, and that the United States of America should, like we do on terrorism, work with any country in the world that might be the target of an aggressor like Vladimir Putin. So I'm grateful to you for what you've contributed to our investigation. This hearing's now adjourned.
Pretty good. Almost did it. mentioned it as an yes, yes. Oh, it's all right, yeah. Yes, we enjoy it.
Maybe that's not there.
Because every department says he's such a pain in the neck, I can't know what to do. This would be the way we sort of celebrate. Yeah.
But anyways, telling all Mr.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. How's life in Georgia? Oh, well, you know, I was many times there in Georgia. Really. It was actually was the president, and I knew him before, and yes, come back to for church. Yeah, but I haven't been in a while.
But that was fine. Actually, we were doing meeting directly from the no culture of Georgia basketball show throughout the year.
Good.
As of since yesterday.
And, really? Oh, I didn't know.